Typically, nonfiction books not about true crimes, specifically political nonfiction books, are not my cup of tea. But I was browsing audible.com for what to spend my latest precious monthly audiobook credit on. I was oddly captivated by the image of Justice on Trial, the Kavanaugh Confirmation, and Future of the Supreme Court. The book was released on July 9, 2019, almost a year after Kavanaugh's appointment, and I frankly thought this subject had been absolutely talked to death already. What revelations were these two women authors going to uncover at this point? What conclusions could they draw that I hadn't already repeatedly considered myself ad nauseum? And I can't tell you how happy I am that I was dead wrong. The authors are Mollie Hemingway, a senior editor at The Federalist and a contributor to Fox News, and Carrie Severino, who is chief counsel and policy director of the Judicial Crisis Network, a graduate of Harvard Law School who also clerked for Justice Clarence Thomas. For this book, they interviewed more than 100 people, including dozens of senators, President Donald Trump, and several Supreme Court justices. They do an excellent postmortem of the entire story, from Justice Kennedy's surprise retirement through the scandal and ultimate confirmation of Kavanaugh, which I won't bore you with, since unless you were living under a rock, you can recite chapter and verse at this point, and no doubt have strong, deeply held opinions about it. But they do highlight a few important elements that you might have missed in the coverage that I found absolutely fascinating. Number one, they explain the history of Supreme Court nominations by Republican presidents, which Democrats attempted to torpedo for purely political reasons through outright lies and invented scandals that were intended to ruin the lives of the nominees and warn off future constitutional originalist judges from seeking the appointment prior to Kavanaugh. President Ronald Reagan nominated Judge Robert Bork in 1987. Within 45 minutes of Bork's nomination to the court, Senator Ted Kennedy took the Senate floor with a strong condemnation of Bork in a nationally televised speech declaring, "Robert Bork's America is a land in which women would be forced into back alley abortions. Blacks would sit at segregated lunch counters. Rogue police could break down citizens' doors in midnight raids, and the school children could not be taught about evolution. Writers and artists could be censored at the whim of the government, and the doors of federal courts would be shut on the fingers of millions of citizens." On July 5, 1987, the NAACP executive director Benjamin Hooks described their position on the Bork nomination. Quote, "We will fight it all the way until hell freezes over, and then we'll skate across the ice." Unquote. A brief was prepared for Joe Biden, head of the Senate Judiciary Committee, called the Biden Report. Bork later said in his book, The Tempting of America, that the report, quote, "so thoroughly misrepresented a plain record that it easily qualifies as world-class in the category of scurrility," unquote. TV ads produced by People for the American Way and narrated by actor Gregory Peck attacked Bork as an extremist. Along with Kennedy's speech, these ads successfully fueled widespread public skepticism of Bork's nomination. The rapid response of Kennedy's Robert Bork's America speech stunned the Reagan White House. Though conservatives considered Kennedy's accusation slanderous, the attacks went unanswered for 2.5 months. Ultimately, the Senate rejected Bork's nomination to the Supreme Court by a roll call vote of 42 to 58. The second attempt was in 1991 when George H.W. Bush nominated Judge Clarence Thomas, where towards the end of the confirmation process, a confidential FBI report was leaked by the Senate to the media regarding the sexual harassment allegations of Thomas by Anita Hill, a law professor who had worked under Thomas previously. Thomas was confirmed by a narrow majority of 52 to 48. At the time he was confirmed, 2/3 of Americans polled believed Clarence Thomas over Anita Hill. In the intervening years, the constant liberal media and education establishment have drummed revisionist history into our heads on that point. We would do well not to allow them to do the same to Kavanaugh moving forward. So nobody should have been shocked when one and then multiple sexual assault and harassment allegations came out against Kavanaugh publicly, rather than through the proper channels through a classified FBI report to the Senate. That's why Senator Dianne Feinstein waited almost a month and a half after she had Christine Blasey Ford's letter accusing Kavanaugh of assault. It's also why Feinstein contacted Ford to advise her on getting an attorney who administered Ford a polygraph test before the letter, which, again, Feinstein says she didn't leak to the press and was planning on doing nothing with since Ford requested privacy, because that makes sense. Seriously, think about that timeline and tell me Feinstein didn't leak that letter. Why in God's name are Democrats so happy to use potentially life-ruining lies to try to derail the nominations of judges who are too conservative? Why is the media so breathless to assist them, and why don't principled, honorable Democrat citizens see right through this tactic? 3 words. Roe v. Wade. There appears to be nothing as sacred to the Democrats as the right to irresponsibly have unprotected sex and kill the resulting fetus as often as you please. It completely deranges their rational faculties. They are absolutely petrified that one too many conservative Supreme Court justices will lead to living in a Handmaid's Tale-esque dystopia. As if the judges appointed by Republican presidents never pussy out and rule contrary to the mainstream Republican orthodoxy, except for the 3 Republican-nominated Supreme Court Justices O'Connor, Souter, and Kennedy, who authored the Casey decision that reaffirmed Roe v. Wade. As if Kavanaugh hadn't explicitly talked about his view that abortion precedents were settled law. And one more thing liberals never willingly acknowledge: Roe v. Wade is a terrible decision from a legal standpoint, which made up rights out of thin fucking air. Even super liberal, weekend at Bernie's corpse Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg acknowledges it was a faulty decision that did more harm than good for the cause of abortion rights. And if, in some alternate, bizarro world, the conservative judges ever located their sacks and didn't mind being pariahs at all future Washington cocktail parties and really felt like killing babies was wrong and reversed Roe v. Wade, so what? So abortion goes back to being a question of individual states' law? So women in red states might need to buy a $100 bus or airplane ticket to go to their closest neighboring blue state where abortion is legal? It's not like abortions don't cost anything currently. $100 and an extra hour or 2 added to your travel time to kill your unborn child doesn't seem like the craziest hurdle to get so fucking worked up over. Unless you're one of the 10 women in Alaska and you have an unwanted pregnancy. I could see how that could be a tad inconvenient. And I get it. Democrats want a buffer zone around abortion. It's an important issue for them. They don't want to have to go to Tijuana like they used to, or use rusty coat hangers in back alleys. So they overreached with Roe v. Wade, and are overly protective of it so that it never gets to the point where they really need to sweat about having to carry a child to term and give it up for adoption. But weirdly, they never accept this "we want a buffer of absurd law around an important principle" argument when conservatives make it about the First or Second Amendment, which, unlike abortion, are explicitly stated as rights in the Constitution. Imagine Republicans actually having the courage to say, you know what? We know bump stocks, easier to procure suppressors, universal concealed carry permits that work for all 50 states, or the digital files for 3D printed guns are stupid and might kill a few people a year if totally legalized. But we want them so that you never even get close enough to touch the core of what the Second Amendment requires. Would Democrats respect our wishes the way we've kowtowed to theirs on abortion? Not on your life. Lastly, this book makes the case so clearly why Donald Trump, despite his shortcomings, is exactly the president that this country needs right now. Kavanaugh was a Bush White House staff guy, and the entirety of the confirmation clusterfuck, Bush's guys were advising Kavanaugh to use a light touch, coming out against Blasey Ford and the other absurd accusations. Fighting too hard, showing any anger, acknowledging the crazy injustice he and his family were being subjected to would have been seen as uncouth, they argued. But then Kavanaugh was reminded that Bush wasn't the guy who nominated him. Brett was a Trump nominee, and Trump is a fighter. It seems to the authors of this book, as well as to me, that George W. Bush, if met with the same opposition and bad press that Kavanaugh was subjected to, would have pulled his nomination. And Brett would have been an unhirable pariah the rest of his life. But Donald Trump is immune to charges of being uncouth. And in this zero-sum game with Democrats willing to call anyone anything, that makes him the ultimate weapon. Hopefully, all future Republican presidents, senators, and would-be justices take to heart the courage shown by Trump, Lindsey Graham, and Brett Kavanaugh. Weirdly, Amazon.com appears to be playing some games with the ranking of this book, but it was a #1 Amazon bestseller in nonfiction. It was ranked #2 in Barnes & Noble nonfiction, and it was ranked #3 in USA Today for overall books. I cannot recommend this book highly enough. Do yourself a favor and go out and buy it.
Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows.
Hi guys, Media Shadow here. I'm trying to grow the channel and hopefully get more than one video out a week. So if you like what you've seen, please give me a like, subscribe, share, or drop me some coin on Patreon. I've left a link in the description of the video. Thanks!